When war erupted across Europe in September 1939, it did not only mobilize armies, it transformed the private lives of millions, particularly the women who remained behind. In Nazi Germany, where ideology had long dictated that a woman's place was in the home, the onset of total war turned domesticity into both a weapon and a burden. German women, once idealized as gentle homemakers and bearers of the Aryan race, found themselves thrust into new and often conflicting roles. They became the silent engines of the Reich's survival, balancing household duties, factory labor, and emotional endurance amid fear, deprivation, and propaganda. In the early years of the conflict, the Nazi regime still clung to its vision of womanhood as passive and domestic. Adolf Hitler had famously declared that women's world was her husband, her family, her children, and her home. The state reinforced this ideal through endless propaganda. Posters showing smiling mothers in aprons, radio programs celebrating the virtues of sacrifice, and awards like the Mother's Cross, given to those who bore many children. For these women, motherhood was not simply personal, it was patriotic. Bearing and raising racially pure children was considered an act of loyalty to the fatherland. Yet the demands of total war soon exposed the fragility of that ideology. As German men marched to the front and casualties mounted, women were drawn into public life out of necessity. Factories, farms, hospitals, and offices, once dominated by men, now depended on female labor. Women took up jobs as clerks, tram conductors, nurses, and even munitions workers. Some joined the war effort directly as auxiliaries in the Luftwaffe or Wehrmacht, manning anti-aircraft batteries or serving as secretaries in occupied territories. Despite official reluctance to recognize them as equal participants, their work became indispensable to maintaining the Nazi war machine. Life on the home front was marked by scarcity, fear, and adaptation. Rationing began as early as 1939, and by the mid-war years, every household operated under strict quotas. Housewives became masters of improvisation, stretching flour with sawdust, making ersatz coffee from roasted barley, and sewing clothing from old curtains. Cookbooks of the era taught women how to feed a family with almost nothing, turning frugality into a patriotic virtue. The government's Eintopf-Sonntag, or one-pot Sunday, encouraged families to eat super meals and donate savings to the war fund. In this way, domestic chores became acts of national service. The emotional strain, however, could not be rationed. Women bore the psychological toll of constant uncertainty, waiting for letters from husbands at the front, dreading the knock that signaled a telegram of death. Many became single parents overnight, responsible not only for children, but for elderly relatives. Air raids added to the terror. Cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne were bombed relentlessly, forcing civilians to live between the routine of daily chores and the sudden chaos of destruction. Mothers shepherded their children to shelters, singing softly to drown out the thunder of explosions. The home, once a sanctuary, became a fragile structure of fear and resolve. In rural areas, the war created a different rhythm of hardship. With so many men conscripted, women took over farms almost entirely, managing livestock and crops while also maintaining households. Agricultural labor was grueling, yet many women took pride in sustaining the nation's food supply. At the same time, they were expected to host forced laborers, foreign workers brought from occupied countries, often under watchful eyes of local officials. These interactions were tense and complex, revealing both the daily intimacy and moral compromises of life in a totalitarian society. Propaganda remained omnipresent, shaping not only public opinion but private emotion. The Ministry of Propaganda urged women to remain cheerful, disciplined, and loyal, portraying suffering as noble and inevitable. Magazines like Frau im Reich featured articles about keeping the home bright for the soldier, encouraging women to suppress despair and embody resilience. Religion, though discouraged by the regime, remained a quiet refuge for many. In churches and whispered prayers, women sought meaning in a world collapsing around them. By 1943, as Germany's war fortunes waned after defeats in Stalingrad and North Africa, even the facade of control began to crumble. Rationing tightened, bombings intensified, and morale plummeted. Women were urged into total war by Joseph Goebbels himself, who proclaimed that every German must serve. Housewives were recruited for labor brigades, teenagers were drafted into anti-aircraft units, and grandmothers queued for hours in front of bakeries that had no bread. The once prized image of the serene, obedient woman gave way to that of the exhausted survivor. Letters and diaries from this period revealed the private struggles behind the propaganda. Many women wrote of the loneliness of waiting, the guilt of survival, and the silent disillusionment with the Nazi state. Some still clung to faith in Hitler, while others, though afraid to speak it aloud, saw through the lies. The walls of kitchens and shelters absorbed their silent doubts, their grief over sons never returning, and their quiet defiance in simply carrying on. When Germany finally collapsed in 1945, the experiences of these women reached their breaking point. The Allied invasion brought not only liberation, but also suffering, mass displacement, hunger, and violence. The advance of the Red Army was marked by widespread sexual assault, leaving deep scars that would haunt survivors for decades. In the aftermath, women once again became the backbone of survival. They cleared the rubble from cities, rebuilt homes, and scavenged for food in what became known as the Hunger Winter of 1946 to 1947. Yet in this devastation lay transformation. The war had broken the chains of dependence that ideology had imposed. Women who had managed households through years of crisis, who had negotiated with soldiers, ration boards, and occupying authorities, emerged with a new sense of agency. They were no longer the passive housewives of the 1930s, but the pragmatic, resilient architects of post-war recovery. Their endurance, born of necessity rather than ideology, became the moral foundation of Germany's rebirth. The daily life of German women during World War II thus was a study in paradox. It was shaped by obedience, yet defined by survival, framed by propaganda, yet sustained by quiet rebellion. Their kitchens became command centers of endurance, their routines acts of courage. They carried the weight of both complicity and suffering, embodying the contradictions of a society at war with itself. In the year 1939, as the first light of dawn broke across a Europe teetering on the edge of chaos, the women of Germany awoke to a world that was rapidly transforming into a landscape of uncertainty, fervor, and fear. For years, they had lived under the suffocating ideology of the National Socialist regime, which had woven its tendrils into every aspect of their daily existence, from the nursery to the workplace, from the church pew to the factory floor. Hitler's rise to power had brought promises of national renewal and stability, and for many German women, those early years of the Third Reich had indeed offered a sense of order and belonging that the tumultuous Weimar years could not provide. The state exalted their roles as mothers, homemakers, and symbols of racial purity, wrapping their identities in a cloak of patriotic duty. Yet beneath the surface of orchestrated propaganda and marching parades, a quiet unease lingered, a feeling that the peace so fervently celebrated was brittle, that the stability was only a prelude to something darker. When German troops crossed the Polish border on September 1, 1939, that illusion shattered forever. The announcement of war crackled through radios across the nation, and for many women, it came not with jubilation, but with a numb, cold dread. Mothers clutched their sons, wives stood motionless as their husbands donned uniforms. Young girls whispered about glory and sacrifice, repeating the words their teachers had fed them. The rhythms of daily life began to warp under the weight of mobilization. Shops once filled with household goods now displayed ration cards and propaganda posters urging thrift and sacrifice. Women were told it was their sacred duty to hold the home front together, to be both nurturers and soldiers in their own right. The League of German Girls, Bond Deutscher Mädel, instructed young women to stay healthy, learn domestic skills, and prepare to bear children for the Reich. The Nazi state viewed women as biological instruments of the nation's destiny, their fertility equated with victory. Those who conformed found a certain security in obedience. Those who questioned faced social isolation or worse. By 1940, as the war expanded across Europe, the atmosphere in Germany oscillated between triumph and exhaustion. The stunning victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries filled newspapers with headlines of glory, and women were encouraged to celebrate the valor of their soldiers. Yet in kitchens and courtyards, beneath the veneer of pride, anxiety simmered. Food supplies began to tighten, men were absent for longer, and the once lively streets grew quieter as the war machine consumed more and more of the nation's vitality. For women, survival became an act of adaptation. They learned to stretch every ration, to mend clothes beyond repair, to smile through the fear that their sons might never return. In rural villages, women took over farms, managing livestock and harvests alone. In cities, they became clerks, drivers, and factory workers, filling the spaces men left behind. The state continued to preach the purity of motherhood, yet its demands for labor contradicted its own ideology. Women were no longer just homemakers. They were the engine oil of a nation at war. In letters from the front, husbands wrote of frozen nights in trenches and the roar of artillery. In return, wives described blackout curtains, air raid drills, and the loneliness of waiting. Across the country, fear and fatigue coexisted with a strange numbness, the normalization of the extraordinary. For German women, the dawn of war was not marked by fanfare, but by a slow erosion of normal life. Each day demanded new resilience, each night brought dreams of peace that seemed ever more distant. By the end of 1940, as bombs began to fall on German cities and the first signs of long conflict emerged, women had become the silent backbone of a nation spiraling into total war. They bore the burden of endurance, holding together the fraying threads of family, faith, and identity under the shadow of a war that would soon consume everything they knew. As the war deepened into its second and third years, the heart of Germany no longer pulsed with the triumphant rhythm of conquest, but with the slow, strained beat of endurance. For the women left behind, the home front had become a battlefield of its own, one not fought with guns and tanks, but with ration books, queues, and endless fatigue. The grand promises of swift victory had given way to the harsh reality of scarcity, labor, and loss. Hitler's government, having proclaimed that a woman's place was in the home, now found itself demanding that every capable hand contribute to the war effort. Propaganda posters urged women to be both the heart and muscle of the nation, to embody resilience as their sons and husbands fought on distant fronts. Factories that had once produced domestic goods were now converted to manufacture weapons, uniforms, and munitions. The rhythmic clatter of sewing machines was replaced by the metallic roar of assembly lines, where women stood for hours riveting, welding, and inspecting parts destined for the front. Housewives became factory workers overnight, many with little training but immense determination. Their hands, once soft from washing linen and kneading bread, grew calloused and blackened by grease. Still, they labored on, driven by both fear and duty. In the countryside, the war's toll was just as heavy. With men gone, women took on the back-breaking work of farming alone. They plowed fields, milked cows, and harvested crops, often with only aging parents or young children to help. The Nazi regime's Reich labor service for women assigned thousands to agricultural or industrial labor, glorifying their sweat as a patriotic offering to the Führer. Posters portrayed smiling young women in kerchiefs holding tools or sheaves of wheat, but reality bore little resemblance to those polished images. Hunger crept into kitchens like a silent enemy. Rationing had begun early, and by 1941 it had become the defining rhythm of domestic life. Butter, meat, sugar, and coffee were luxuries. Ersatz substitutes filled their place. Women learned to stretch ingredients creatively, making soups from scraps, turning potato peels into meals, sewing patches upon patches on worn clothes. Markets were filled with lines rather than goods, and the sound of gossip replaced the clinking of coins. Every household had its own rituals of survival. Mothers rose before dawn to fetch water or coal, to light stoves with whatever fuel they could find. The smell of substitute coffee, bitter and burnt, filled cold rooms. Children were bundled off to school or to Hitler Youth gatherings where they were taught songs of loyalty and sacrifice. Letters from the front arrived irregularly, each one a mixture of hope and dread. Many women opened envelopes with trembling hands, scanning for familiar handwriting and signs that their loved ones still lived. Some letters spoke of pride and comradeship, others hinted at exhaustion, hunger, or despair. The censor's black lines often hid the truth, but between the words, women learned to read silence. When letters stopped coming altogether, they carried on, clinging to the faint hope that absence did not mean death. Religion and superstition found new strength in these years. Churches filled with women praying for sons and husbands, while others pinned photographs beside candles and whispered names like incantations. Faith, in whatever form it took, became a lifeline. Yet even as faith comforted some, others grew disillusioned. The promises of the Reich, prosperity, unity, glory, rang hollow amid empty shelves and bomb sirens. The contradictions of Nazi ideology became harder to ignore. Women were exalted as mothers and moral pillars, yet condemned if they showed weakness or sorrow. They were told to produce children for the fatherland as their own children went hungry. Many widows were labeled heroes of sacrifice. Others were quietly forgotten. Social hierarchies tightened as the regime reinforced racial and political divides. Aryan women received privileges, while Jewish women, foreign laborers, and political prisoners endured unspeakable hardship. By 1942, millions of forced laborers, many of them women from occupied countries, were brought into Germany. They worked alongside German women, but under vastly different conditions, marked by cruelty and deprivation. The contrast was stark. One woman toiling for her nation's glory, another for her survival. Compassion, though dangerous, still flickered. Some German women shared food or kindness in secret, aware that even small acts of mercy could draw punishment. As air raids began to intensify, the war came home in a new, terrifying form. Sirens wailed across cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne, driving women and children into crowded shelters. The ground shook, walls cracked, and the sky glowed red as bombs rained down. After each raid, women emerged to find their neighborhoods reduced to rubble. They cleared debris, searched for survivors, and rebuilt with bare hands. They learned to live with constant fear of fire, of loss, of silence between sirens. Nights became endless, punctuated by explosions and the cries of the wounded. Yet even in the ruins, life persisted. Weddings were held in basements, babies were born amid dust, songs were sung quietly in defiance of despair. The home front had become a crucible, forging endurance in the face of relentless strain. Women learned to live without comfort, to find strength in community, to endure humiliation without breaking. Many became leaders within their families, making decisions once reserved for men. They balanced accounts, dealt with officials, and navigated the growing bureaucracy of wartime Germany. The Gestapo's reach extended into every neighborhood, and careless words could lead to arrest. Women learned to speak in coded language, to trust no one completely, to mask their emotions behind smiles of compliance. But even under surveillance, small acts of rebellion survived. A loaf of bread shared with a neighbor, a band song hummed softly, a radio secretly tuned to foreign broadcasts. By 1943, as casualties mounted and the tide of war began to turn, the emotional burden became heavier. Women bore not only the physical weight of survival, but also the psychological toll of fear, grief, and moral confusion. The propaganda still urged them to believe in victory, but the letters, the funerals, and the whispers said otherwise. Entire generations of women grew old before their time, their youth consumed by war. Their hands trembled from exhaustion, their hearts hardened by loss. And yet, amid the despair, a quiet defiance grew, a belief that somehow they would endure, even if the Reich did not. The home front was no longer just a place of waiting, it was the front line of human resilience. The burden these women carried was immense, invisible, and immeasurable. Yet it was upon their shoulders that the fabric of everyday life clung. The war, though waged by men in distant lands, was sustained by the strength of women who refused to surrender to despair, who held together families, neighborhoods, and the very notion of civilization as the world around them crumbled. By 1941, the war had reached a fevered pitch, and the German home front transformed into a vast engine of production and endurance. The invasion of the Soviet Union opened a new, brutal chapter in the conflict, stretching Germany's resources to the breaking point. As men vanished to the Eastern Front, and the Reich's demands multiplied, women became the indispensable workforce of the nation. Factories, fields, offices, and hospitals now teemed with female laborers, millions of them, who toiled day and night under the gaze of Nazi efficiency and the shadow of total war. The contradiction of the regime's gender ideology had never been so glaring. Women, once idealized as homemakers and mothers, were now essential soldiers of industry. Posters proclaimed, "The woman's hands build the Reich's victory," and propaganda films depicted smiling workers assembling weapons and aircraft parts. In truth, the work was grueling, repetitive, and dangerous. Long hours in dim, unheated halls left women exhausted, their fingers raw from metal and oil. Many labored with little rest, driven by quotas that grew increasingly impossible as materials dwindled. Supervisors, often party officials or soldiers too injured for combat, watched over them with rigid discipline. Mistakes were punished harshly, yet the women persevered, knowing that every bullet, every uniform, every tank tread might help bring their loved ones home alive. The pressure of survival bore down on every household. Air raids intensified across Germany, forcing women to balance industrial labor with constant vigilance. Factories were camouflaged, work continued during bombardments, and sirens became as common as church bells. Many women spent nights huddled in bunkers, children pressed against them, before returning to work at dawn. Fatigue became their constant companion, but so too did resilience. They learned to move through life with a mechanical rhythm, one eye on the clock, the other on the sky. In cities, especially Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, the streets were filled with uniforms, soldiers on leave, factory workers, and foreign laborers. By 1942, millions of workers from occupied countries were brought into Germany to sustain the war economy. Among them were prisoners of war and forced laborers, including women and children. German women encountered them daily in factories, on farms, in kitchens, and the encounters were fraught with tension. Official propaganda demanded distance and superiority, but reality blurred such lines. There were silent exchanges of food, gestures of pity, and moments of shared exhaustion that transcended ideology. These acts, as small as they were, carried quiet defiance against the regime's inhumanity. Meanwhile, rationing grew harsher. The early optimism of victory was gone, replaced by a grim practicality. Meat, butter, and coffee were scarce luxuries. The diet of most families consisted of potatoes, cabbage, and ersatz bread. Women became masters of substitution, stretching meals, reusing every scrap, even boiling old bones for broth. Soap, once ordinary, became a rare treasure. Many washed with cold water and ash, their skin cracked and raw. Yet they found dignity in resourcefulness, in keeping their homes clean and their children fed against all odds. The Nazi regime encouraged this stoicism, promoting the ideal German woman as strong, loyal, and uncomplaining. Magazines featured stories of heroic mothers and tireless workers, urging others to emulate them. But behind those polished images lay the unspoken truth of exhaustion and grief. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers, and trains carried the dead back in sealed coffins. Women waited on platforms, hoping for survivors, dreading telegrams that began with the words, "We regret to inform you." The emotional toll of these years was immense. Every family knew loss. Every street bore the absence of men who would never return. Children grew up in the language of war, drawing tanks and planes instead of flowers. Mothers learned to hide tears, to turn grief into labor. And yet, amid the devastation, some women discovered new strength, a sense of purpose born not of ideology but necessity. They managed ration centers, directed youth groups, ran hospitals, and repaired machinery. Some became de facto heads of household, balancing authority with tenderness. Others found themselves drawn into darker currents, working for the party or the SS, driven by conviction or fear. In occupied territories, German women served as nurses, clerks, or wives of officers, living lives of privilege built on oppression. Their letters home often spoke of hardship, but also of a strange normality, gardens, dinners, and small comforts preserved amid the chaos. In contrast, those still at home lived under the constant strain of bombardment. By late 1942, as the tide turned against Germany at Stalingrad, hope began to wane. The myth of invincibility crumbled, and for the first time, people whispered doubts. Yet even then, public dissent remained dangerous. Women who spoke too freely risked denunciation, imprisonment, or worse. Gestapo surveillance was omnipresent, and fear became a second language. The rhythm of life narrowed to essentials: work, food, safety. Every day repeated the same grim cycle, yet within it flickered something indestructible: the will to live. Even as bombs fell and cities burned, the women of Germany carried on, holding together families, factories, and fragments of civilization. Their strength did not come from ideology, but from the primal instinct to protect, to rebuild, to endure. Between 1941 and 1943, the German woman became the silent axis of survival, uncelebrated, unseen, yet indispensable. Her story, written not in speeches but in sweat and sacrifice, defined the true front line of the war. By 1944, The once proud cities of Germany had become fields of ruin, their skylines fractured by fire and smoke. The sound of sirens had long replaced the rhythms of everyday life, and the war that had begun as a promise of glory now lay heavy upon every doorstep. Women, who had borne the burdens of labor and loss, now faced the greatest test of endurance. They were no longer the silent workers of the home front. They had become survivors in a nation collapsing around them. The Allied bombings struck with relentless force, reducing entire neighborhoods to ashes. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, names that once evoked power and pride, became synonymous with devastation. Each raid brought death from the skies, and beneath the rubble lay the echoes of lives extinguished. Women, with no uniforms or medals, became the rescuers, the nurses, the mourners. They dug through debris with bare hands, searching for children, for parents, for something to hold on to. The air reeked of dust and smoke, the earth trembled with each detonation, yet they moved through it all with a numb determination that defied despair. Their faces were blackened by soot, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights, but still they rose each morning to clear the ruins and begin again. In every city, women became the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, symbols of a broken nation's will to survive. Armed with shovels, buckets, and sheer resolve, they cleared streets, stone by stone, brick by brick, forming human chains amid the wreckage. They worked not for pay or praise, but because life demanded it. Children watched from the edges, learning that survival was built not on victory, but on endurance. The government's propaganda machine continued to insist on hope, but even its voice faltered. Speeches promised miracle weapons and certain triumph, but the women in the ruins saw the truth. The faces of refugees filled the streets, gaunt, hollow-eyed, carrying what little they owned on their backs. The front lines were closing in, and the illusion of German dominance crumbled with every passing week. Fear seeped into every corner, fear of invasion, of betrayal, of starvation. Food became scarcer still. Bread was rationed to crumbs, meat a fading memory. Women scavenged in gardens, bartered on black markets, and queued for hours for a handful of potatoes. Hunger hollowed their cheeks but could not extinguish their will. Some turned to theft, others to trade or secrecy, each finding ways to survive in a world stripped of rules. Morality, like order, had become a luxury. Yet even amid such desperation, small acts of defiance flickered like candlelight. Resistance took many forms: a loaf of bread shared with a foreign laborer, a whispered criticism of the Führer, a leaflet hidden beneath a floorboard. These acts were dangerous, punishable by imprisonment or death. But they were the seeds of moral resilience. Among the women, quiet networks formed, some religious, others political, each bound by the shared conviction that humanity must outlast tyranny. The White Rose, a student resistance movement centered in Munich, had already shown what courage could cost. By 1944, even the faintest act of dissent carried mortal risk. Yet courage persisted. Women smuggled food to prisoners, sheltered fugitives, and spread whispers of truth in a world built on lies. The Gestapo's presence was everywhere, in offices, in neighborhoods, even among families. But suspicion could not entirely suppress compassion. For many women, resistance was not political, but personal, the act of maintaining dignity amid degradation. In hospitals, nurses tended to the wounded with tenderness, even when supplies ran out. Teachers continued lessons in bombed-out schools, writing arithmetic on chalkboards cracked by blast waves. Mothers told their children stories by candlelight, shielding them from the sounds of death outside. These small gestures were their own form of defiance, a refusal to let war consume the essence of humanity. By the autumn of 1944, the tide had turned irrevocably. The Allies advanced from the west, the Soviets from the east. German cities became corridors of flight, filled with refugees fleeing before the Red Army. Fear of the advancing Soviets spread through the population, fed by propaganda and rumor. Women feared not only for their lives, but for their honor, as stories of rape and revenge circulated. Trains overflowed with families clutching whatever they could carry. Mothers pressed infants to their chests, old women leaned on walking sticks, and teenage girls walked miles through snow, their shoes falling apart, driven by the desperate hope of finding safety. The roads of Germany became rivers of suffering. Those who remained in the cities faced the nightly infernos of bombing and the daily struggle to endure. The once orderly rhythms of society disintegrated into chaos. Air raid shelters became homes, streets became graves. The Nazi hierarchy clung to its fantasies of control, but even loyal citizens now whispered of the inevitable end. When Hitler demanded total war, it was the women who bore its full meaning. They worked longer hours, buried their dead, and endured a government that demanded sacrifice while offering nothing in return. Faith in the Reich had been replaced by a single desperate desire: survival. As 1945 dawned, the war entered its final catastrophic phase. The front collapsed on all sides, and Allied troops advanced into Germany itself. Cities became battlefields, and women once again found themselves in the crossfire. In the east, as the Soviet army swept through Prussia and Silesia, the horrors multiplied. The Red Army's vengeance fell hardest on civilians, and women bore the brunt. Thousands were raped, beaten, or killed. Entire towns were razed. The trauma was unspeakable, and for decades afterward, silence would be the only language left to describe it. In the West, the Americans and British occupied cities that surrendered, bringing both relief and humiliation. German women greeted soldiers with a mix of fear, curiosity, and hope. Many sought protection through relationships, sometimes genuine, sometimes transactional, born of desperation rather than affection. The war had stripped away moral boundaries. Survival was the only law. When Hitler took his own life in April 1945 and Berlin fell, there was no triumph, no closure, only exhaustion. The radio broadcasts announcing Germany's surrender brought tears not of joy, but of incredulity. The war that had consumed 6 years, millions of lives, and the very soul of a nation was finally over. Yet for the women, the end was merely another beginning, of reckoning, of rebuilding, of remembering. They emerged from basements and bunkers to find a landscape of ashes. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins, not just its cities and fields, but the very fabric of its soul. The once proud nation that had marched to the beat of military parades now stumbled through rubble, haunted by defeat, guilt, and hunger. For German women, the war's end did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of struggle. They emerged from basements, bunkers, and refugee camps into a world that barely resembled the one they had known. The landscape was a vast graveyard of stone and ash. Roads were choked with wreckage. Bridges lay collapsed across rivers, and the skeletons of bombed buildings rose like monuments to despair. Amidst this devastation, women became the architects of survival. Their husbands, fathers, and sons were dead, missing, or prisoners of war, and the task of rebuilding fell to those who had already borne the heaviest burdens. They picked up shovels once more, clearing streets of rubble, salvaging bricks and creating shelters out of ruins. These women, the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, became the backbone of post-war Germany. Their labor was not glorified by parades or medals. It was born of necessity. They worked with bare hands and aching backs, stacking bricks, sweeping dust, and rebuilding walls one by one. Children played among ruins that once had been homes, their laughter mingling with the clang of shovels. Life persisted stubbornly, even amid desolation. The immediate post-war years were marked by chaos and hunger. Food supplies were scarce, transportation broken, and the Allied occupation brought both order and humiliation. Women stood in endless lines for bread, traded heirlooms for potatoes, and scavenged whatever they could find. In cities like Berlin, survival became an art of improvisation. Gardens sprouted in bomb craters, clothes were patched until the fabric gave way, and soap was a luxury remembered more than experienced. The black market thrived, and with it came moral compromises that no one judged too harshly because judgment itself had become a casualty of war. The occupying armies, American, British, French, and Soviet, brought with them both aid and exploitation. In the Soviet zone, many women endured renewed violence. The trauma of 1945 left scars that would never fully heal. Yet, amid the brutality, acts of compassion emerged as well. Allied soldiers shared chocolate with starving children. Relief organizations distributed milk and medicine. For women who had lived through 6 years of war, such small mercies became seeds of renewal. Germany was divided into zones, and so too were the destinies of its women. In the West, under American and British administration, Reconstruction began slowly but steadily. Women joined local councils, reopened schools, and rebuilt businesses. In the East, under Soviet control, women became central to socialist propaganda, hailed as the new proletarian builders of the future. Yet regardless of ideology, the essence of survival remained the same: work, endurance, and the will to rebuild from nothing. Families reunited in fragments. Some men returned years later from prisoner camps, strangers to the wives and children who had long assumed them dead. The emotional chasm was vast. Marriages strained under the weight of loss and guilt. Children, raised by women alone, found their fathers foreign. Many women chose independence, having learned that survival depended on their own strength. The war had stripped them of illusions, but also of limitations. They had worked in factories, driven trucks, negotiated with officials, and managed households through scarcity and danger. In doing so, they had discovered resilience that no ideology could erase. Yet the psychological burden remained immense. The collective guilt of the nation settled heavily on every conscience. News of the Holocaust and the atrocities committed in Germany's name reached the public through Allied tribunals and photographs. For many women, the revelations were unbearable. Some had suspected, others had known, and many had simply chosen silence. Now, silence was no longer possible. The moral reckoning began, not in speeches, but in quiet shame and reflection. Churches filled with those seeking forgiveness. Confessions were whispered in private. Women who had lost everything struggled to reconcile their suffering with the horrors inflicted by their nation. Some refused to believe, clinging to denial as a shield against despair. Others confronted the truth head-on, determined to rebuild not only their homes, but their humanity. Education became a cornerstone of renewal. Teachers, many of them women, returned to classrooms, guiding children through lessons that balanced arithmetic with morality. New textbooks replaced Nazi propaganda, and for the first time in years, truth was allowed to breathe. The younger generation became the vessel of hope, and mothers instilled in them not the pride of conquest, but the humility of compassion. Cultural life, too, began to stir from the ashes. Theaters reopened, artists painted scenes of ruin and rebirth. Writers chronicled the moral confusion of the times. Women wrote diaries, essays, and novels that captured the raw emotion of survival. Their voices, once silenced by ideology, now emerged as chroniclers of truth. Works by women like Marta Hillers, whose anonymous diary